So the term Black Dutch is a term that was used in historical documents from 1600 to the 1900s. And the term Black Dutch was used to refer to several groups of people, and the term was used in census records, church records, and even old newspaper articles. Some of the groups include Black people of New York, who came from the Netherlands. The Cherokee Indians of North Carolina also identified themselves as the Black Dutch. Many Jews, known as Sephardic Jews, had babies with Africans in America. Their mixed children were also called the Black Dutch. So what does it mean to be Dutch? Dutch is a term used by the Germans, who they themselves call themselves the Dutch people. So a Black Dutch is a Black German or a Black European. And the Black Dutch were actually from Germany, but also mainly from Ireland. Keep in mind that Moor means black. So to say Black Dutch would be like saying a Moor who was a Dutch, and we know that the Moors ruled all of Germany and the rest of all of Europe. So the Black Dutch are Moors from Germany and Ireland, and they are recorded as being in America starting in 1618. Now the time frame of 1618 is very important because we see what was happening in Germany from 1618 to 1648. And it explains why the Moors of Europe, or the Black Dutch, were leaving Germany in the first place. From 1618 to 1648, albinos and beasts of Germany were fighting the Moors of Germany and Ireland. In fact, we can look at what was going on in the 1400s, 200 years before the 1600s. The Moors were already fighting the cave beasts in Germany. And we can see that by this tapestry that is found in Germany, which shows the Moors fighting the Neanderthals. So 200 years later, in 1618, the Moors had been fighting the cave beasts for 200 years at this point at least. And the year 1618 marked the beginning of a 30-year war that broke out between the Moors who ruled all of Europe and the albinos and beasts who were trying to set themselves up as kings and queens of Europe. So although we know the Moors and the cave beasts had many battles for many generations, this particular battle in 1618 is so important because in 1619, this is when we're told the first slave ship arrives to America. And this is 1 year after the war begins with the Moors and the cave beasts. So it's like I said in part 1, the African people who were brought to the Americas in ships were not from Africa, although we know that all African people originate in Africa, but these people were not from Africa or brought from Africa. They were brought from Europe. They were the black nobility of Europe, the original kings and queens, before the Neanderthals. And the Christian Crusades were nothing more than a series of battles that took place between the Neanderthals and the Moors. And Neanderthals weren't going around evangelizing the world. They were going around all of Europe, then later the Americas, and killing the Moors and the native people. And the cross is not a Christian symbol. It was worn by the Moors first. You see, the Muslims call it the Muslim Crusades, and it was the Muslims who had crosses that had Arabic inscriptions from the Quran. So it wasn't white Christians going around bearing the image of the cross. It was the Moors who had this image first. In fact, before the Moors were fighting the cave beasts in Europe, the symbol of the cross can be found in Egypt. So black people have a very distorted view of what slavery was, or the so-called slave trade. Nevertheless, it's no coincidence that the first year that we see the census records in 1618 showing us that the Moors were in America, this is the very same year that the 30-year war started between the Moors and the cave beasts. in 1618. And that just so happens to be the very same time frame that slave ships start showing up in the Americas. And when you look closely, you can clearly see that these people were Moors. And another thing is that many people aren't aware of the fact that white people were being sold as slaves in America in the 1800s. So that's 200 years after the Moors were recorded in the census in America in 1618. 200 years later, white people were still being sold as slaves in the 1800s. And more importantly, the issue of white slavery is something rarely discussed. But the enslavement of the white race has been going on since ancient Egypt. And even in the ancient Americas, even all the way back to the flood of Gilgamesh. And white people were still being sold as slaves just 200 years ago in America in the 1800s. So it makes you wonder just how much of the story has really been left out by white people. And I read this article a few months ago, and it was about this white family in America, and they had done some DNA testing trying to figure out what part of Europe they came from. And this family believed that they were pure European. And when they did the DNA test, the results came back that 2-3 generations back, they had black ancestors. So it was interesting to this white family to find out that 2-3 generations ago, they had a black grandfather. And it was interesting because it caused me to look at some other studies. And there are many genetic studies out there that have proven that half of the white people in America, and I'm just roughly guesstimating by saying half, I think it's more like 35%, but roughly half of white people in America have 2 and 3 generations back a black ancestor. And we know that 2-3 generations back, this is when the so-called slave trade was going on. This is when white people came to the Americas. And it's important to know one thing about white people is that half of white people in America came during the first wave. Okay, so half of the white population of America came as the first white settlers. The other half of the white population in America came in the mid-1900s, immigrating from other European countries and settling in America. But it's important to know that that first wave of white people that came to the Americas, they have black blood in their veins to this day. And if you research the first white people who came to America, you will see that the majority of them were married to Moors. So how did the first white settlers really get here? Because once you realize that the Moors were in America in the 1600s, white people who were coming to America during this time were married to the Moors. And almost half of white people in America have black blood running through their veins from 2 and 3 generations back, proving that they mingled with the Moors. And white people were being sold as slaves in the 1800s. In fact, white people in Kansas in the 1800s were fighting for squatter sovereignty, and they were trying to abolish white slavery. It really makes you rethink how the first white people actually got here in the first place. And we really have to start really deeply thinking about something. Why do white people teach us that we were their slaves, that we were their servants, and not one mention in any history book about the real truth that white people were the slaves to the Egyptians and the Cushites of the world on every continent, long before these cave beasts set themselves up as kings. They were, for thousands of years, the servants of the Egyptians and the Cushites. And we civilized them. We taught them. We taught them everything. We clothed them. We taught them how to speak, how to read, how to write, and we helped them evolve from the beast that they were to modern man. And they repay us by going around the world trying to erase every ounce of our existence, trying to erase every shred of evidence that proves that black people were the original rulers and founders of the earth long before the Neanderthals.